Mom, we've talked about this. It isn't safe for you to live here by yourself anymore. The house is worth a fortune right now. We need to move forward with the sale. When I came home from my doctor's appointment that afternoon, my living room looked like a stranger had emptied my life into boxes. My wedding photographs, Thomas's letters, the quilt my mother stitched by hand when I was 23, 43 years of memories, sealed in cardboard and stacked against the wall. My son, Michael, stood near the fireplace with a brochure for an assisted living community in his hand. "You can't stay here alone anymore, Mom," he said. I had never agreed to leave my home. While Michael and his wife, Lauren, discussed selling my house as if I were already gone, I opened Thomas's old cedar chest. Beneath the loose lining, my fingertips found a small blue diary. Michael had packed almost everything, but he had missed the one thing my husband had hidden to protect me. Before I tell you what Thomas wrote, please like this video, subscribe to Rebecca's Justice Stories, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your own child tried to make this decision for you? And where are you watching from today? End of 6 and tell. And if your own child, and if your own child, and if your own child. My name is Rebecca Clark. I was 68 years old, widowed, and still living in the Willow Creek, Ohio. Home, my husband William and I had worked nearly half our lives to keep. Our house was not grand. It was a brick ranch with a narrow front porch, a green awning that had faded in the sun, and a maple tree by the driveway that William had planted with his own hands. The basement sometimes smelled damp after a hard rain. The guest room closet door stuck in humid weather, and the kitchen cabinets were older than some of my neighbors. But it was mine. More than that, it was ours. William and I bought that house when our son, Michael, was still small enough to fall asleep in the back seat of our old sedan. We had spent 3 years saving every loose dollar we could manage. I worked mornings at the county library and took extra weekend shifts whenever they were offered. William repaired machinery at a plant outside town, coming home with oil on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes. We did not have wealthy parents. We did not have a hidden inheritance. We had a coffee can in the pantry, a strict budget on the refrigerator, and a shared belief that someday we would have a place no landlord could take from us. The day we got the keys, William stood in the empty living room and laughed at the cracked plaster above the fireplace. "Rebecca," he told me, "we may not have much yet, but we've got a front door that belongs to us." That house became the center of our life. We painted Michael's bedroom blue when he was 6. We marked his height in pencil on the laundry room wall. We hosted birthday dinners, Christmas mornings, graduations, cookouts, and the kind of ordinary Sundays that seem forgettable until the people you love are no longer sitting around the table. William died 18 months before the day I found my possessions packed into cardboard boxes. He had been sick for a while, but grief does not become easier simply because you know it is coming. His heart had weakened over the years. Still, he had been the kind of man who insisted on carrying groceries, raking leaves, and fixing whatever broke before calling anyone else. Then, suddenly, he was gone. I remember coming home after the funeral and standing in the doorway with my hand on the lock. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not peaceful. Empty. For several months, I moved through each day one task at a time. I watered the plants. I paid the bills. I went to church. I met my neighbor Patricia for walks around the block. I learned how to sleep alone in a bed that suddenly seemed too wide. I missed William every day, but I was not incapable. I still drove myself to appointments. I managed my prescriptions with a weekly organizer. I cooked, cleaned, handled my finances, and kept the house in decent shape. If something required help, I hired help or called someone I trusted. That was how adults live. They ask for assistance when they need it. They do not surrender their entire lives because someone else decides their age has made their voice optional. At first, Michael's attention after William died seemed loving. He called more often. He brought over groceries. He tightened the railing near the basement steps and changed a porch light that had burned out. Sometimes he arrived with Lauren and their daughter, Emma, and for a few hours, the house sounded alive again. I was grateful. Michael had always been ambitious. A boy. He used to spread notebooks across the dining room table and draw plans for businesses he intended to start. As an adult, he had worked in commercial real estate, always chasing the next deal, the next promotion, the next chance to prove he had outgrown the modest life William and I had given him. He was not cruel as a child. That was what made the change so painful. It began with questions that sounded harmless. Did you remember your medicine today? Mom? Are you sure you locked the patio door? Did you pay the gas bill? Or should I check? The first few times, I smiled and answered him. I told myself that losing his father had frightened him. I told myself, a son checking on his mother was a blessing. Then he began asking the same questions after I had already answered. If I said I was fine, he looked doubtful. If I sounded annoyed, he called me sensitive. If I said I could handle something myself, he sighed, as if I had made his life difficult by remaining competent. One Sunday afternoon, he picked up a stack of envelopes from the counter while I was making coffee. I'll sort through these for you, he said. I reached for them. Thank you, but I've got it. It's no trouble. It is not your mail. Michael? He smiled, but he did not release the envelopes immediately. You don't have to be so guarded. Mom, I'm trying to help. That sentence bothered me for days. Not because he offered help, because he made a boundary sound like an insult. After that, little things began changing around me. A doctor. Patel's office. Michael started insisting on coming into the examination room. When the doctor asked whether I was sleeping, Michael answered before I could. She's up all night, he said. She gets confused in the mornings. I stared at him. I wake up once most nights. I told Dr. Patel, and I am not confused. Michael gave a quiet laugh, like I had misunderstood a joke. Mom doesn't always notice when she's having a rough day. Doctor. Patel looked from him to me. He did not say much then, but I saw the concern flicker across his face. Michael had not needed to lie outright. He only needed to plant doubt. Lauren was less subtle. She began studying my house as though she had been hired to inspect it. The flooring is going to turn buyers away, she said one afternoon. There are no buyers, I replied. The bathroom tile is dated. It has been dated since you married my son. It still works. She gave me a thin smile, then walked toward the living room window. Families are paying a lot for homes in this area now. This property could change your whole situation. My situation is that I live here. She turned back toward me. For now. I heard what she meant. A widow in a house was Croter. To Lauren. Not a person with a home. I was an asset, waiting to be converted into money. The trouble became impossible to ignore when my bank statements stopped coming. For years, I had received them in the first week of every month. I kept them in a file cabinet in the den, next to the property tax receipts and insurance records. Then 1 month passed without a statement. Then another. I also never received the county tax notice. When I asked Michael about it, he barely looked up from his phone. I switched your accounts to electronic delivery. It's easier. You changed my bank settings? I made things simpler for you. You did not ask me. He looked at me the way people look at a child who has misunderstood a grown-up conversation. Mom, This is exactly why we're worried. You get worked up over routine things. I am not worked up. I want to know why you changed something that belongs to me. His face hardened for only a second. Then his expression softened again. Maybe it's time to let someone take some pressure off you. That was when I began paying attention. Not because I believed I was in danger. Not yet. But because I finally understood that Michael was building a story about me. In his version, I was forgetful, emotional, alone, and unable to make decisions. He repeated it so calmly that I could see how easily other people might believe him. The afternoon I went to Dr. Patel for my routine checkup. He gave me a clean bill of health. My blood pressure was good. My medication was working. He encouraged me to continue walking, eating well, and staying connected to friends. Michael had not come with me that day. When I returned home, I expected nothing more dramatic than putting groceries away and making myself tea. Instead, I opened the front door and saw boxes. They were everywhere. Boxes from the hall closet. Boxes from the dining room. Boxes labeled kitchen, linens, books, storage, and upstairs. My framed wedding portrait was leaning against the wall with newspaper wrapped around it. William's old record player was already packed. The quilt my mother had sewn while I was pregnant with Michael sat folded inside an open carton. For a moment, I could not move. Then I saw Michael by the fireplace, holding an assisted living brochure. Lauren stood near the dining room table with her phone in hand, and Michael said the words that made it clear this was not concern. It was a takeover. Mom, we've talked about this. It isn't safe for you to live here by yourself anymore. The house is worth a fortune right now. We need to move forward with the sale. I looked at the boxes, then at my son. We have not talked about selling my home. Michael rubbed his forehead. You have been avoiding the conversation. No, I said. You have been having it without me. Lauren stepped forward. Rebecca, we know this is emotional, but you need a place where people can keep an eye on you. Willow Creek Senior Living is beautiful. You would have meals, transportation, activities, everything. I have everything I need right here. You have stairs, she said. Repairs. Yard. Bills. It is too much responsibility. For whom? I asked. For me? Or for you? The room went still. Michael's voice lowered. We are trying to do the right thing. Then, why are my personal things packed before I agreed to go anywhere? He had no answer. I walked past them and went upstairs, my hands shaking so badly that I had to hold the railing. In our bedroom, I opened William's cedar chest. It had belonged to his grandfather and still smelled faintly of old wood and the pipe tobacco William had given up decades earlier. I searched beneath a stack of winter blankets, then found the loose lining near the bottom. Under it was a small blue diary. William had once told me that the chest had a hidden compartment, but I had forgotten about it. I had not forgotten him. I had simply buried so many memories beneath grief that I stopped looking for them. The diary was worn around the edges. On the first page, in William's familiar handwriting, were the words, For Rebecca, if you ever need the truth more than you need peace. I carried it downstairs, but I did not open it in front of Michael. Not yet. Instead, I returned to the living room and told them both to leave. Michael looked stunned. You're being unreasonable. No, I said. You packed my life into boxes and scheduled a new one for me. You do not get to decide whether I am reasonable. Lauren picked up the brochure. You will understand eventually. I met her eyes. I understand more than you think. They left after that, though Michael paused in the doorway. You are making a mistake by shutting us out, he said. I locked the door behind him. Then I locked it again. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the blue diary in front of me. I wanted to open it. I was afraid to open it. Part of me still wanted to believe Michael had simply panicked after losing his father. But another part of me remembered the missing mail, the changed account settings, the way he spoke over me at the doctor's office, and the way Lauren discussed my home as though the sale had already been promised to her. At sunrise, I read every page. The early entries were practical. Appliance warranties, insurance policy numbers, a reminder to have the furnace inspected before winter. But toward the back, William's notes became longer and more urgent. 3 months before he died, Michael had asked him for money. Not a few $100s. 10,000. He claimed a business partner needed funds to bridge a delay on a commercial project. He promised repayment within 60 days. William wrote that Michael refused to provide paperwork and became defensive when questioned. Then, there had been another request. And another? William had carefully recorded each amount, each promise, each missed deadline. In one entry, he wrote that Lauren had called him and asked him not to embarrass Michael over private family matters. The final entry was only a few lines long. If anything happens to me, Rebecca must speak with Susan Hale before Michael gets access to anything. I have placed protection in motion. He is still our son. But being our son cannot excuse what he is doing. I sat in silence for a long time. William had known something was wrong. He had not told me because he was sick, because he loved Michael, and perhaps because he thought he still had time to fix it quietly. At the back of the diary, I found a phone number for Susan Hale. The next morning, I called. When I gave her my name, her voice changed immediately. "Rebecca," she said gently. "I have been hoping you would call someday, though I wish it were under better circumstances." I found William's diary. There was a pause. "Can you come to my office this afternoon? Bring the diary. Bring any financial records you still have. And please, Rebecca, do not sign one thing your son puts in front of you." Susan Hale's office was above a pharmacy on Main Street. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s with silver hair and a voice that made people stop talking when she asked a question. She read William's diary slowly. Then she opened a locked cabinet and removed a folder with my name on it. "William came to see me 6 weeks before he passed," she said. "He was worried about Michael's debts and about pressure being placed on you." She showed me documents I had never seen. William had created a revocable trust for our home, savings, and a portion of our investment accounts. I remained fully in control as trustee. But if I were ever truly unable to manage my affairs, the next person in line was not Michael. It was Susan. Patricia, my neighbor and closest friend, had been named as an independent contact. Michael could not sell my home. He could not move trust money. He could not place me into a care facility simply because he claimed I was incapable. Any attempt to challenge my capacity would require real medical evidence, independent review, and proper legal notice. Relief rushed through me so quickly that it almost made me cry. Then Susan folded her hands over the file. "Rebecca, the protections William created are strong," she said. "But we need to find out what Michael has already tried to do." That afternoon, she accompanied me to my bank. The branch manager led us into a private office and reviewed my account profile. His polite expression changed as he read the screen. "Mrs. Clark," he said carefully, "your statements were switched to electronic delivery? Your mailing address was temporarily redirected to a post office box. Michael Clark was also added as an authorized contact. I never approved any of that." His eyes moved to Susan. "There is something else," he said. He turned the monitor toward us. A transfer request had been prepared for $85,000 from my savings account into a newly opened investment account. It had not cleared yet, It was waiting for one final confirmation. And according to the account record, that confirmation was scheduled to happen the following morning. The next morning, Susan asked Aaron to cancel the $85,000 transfer before it could be approved. He looked at me one more time. Mrs. Clark, once we stop it, your son will know someone. Reviewed the request. For a few seconds, I could not answer. The hardest part was not deciding whether the transfer was suspicious. The hardest part was accepting that Michael might truly be the person behind it. I remembered him at 8 years old, sitting at my kitchen table with a missing front tooth, asking if he could borrow $2 for the school book fare. I remembered him at 17, begging William to let him use the car for prom. I remembered the look on his face when he held his daughter, Emma. For the first time, those memories did not disappear because I had found a record on a computer screen. But neither did the record disappear because I loved him. Yes, I finally said. Stop the transfer. Remove him from every account he should not be on. Aaron nodded. For the next hour, he and Susan helped me take back what should never have been taken in the first place. We restored my home address. We replaced the unfamiliar email connected to my profile. We reset passwords, removed Michael as an authorized contact, and added additional verification requirements to my accounts. Then Aaron printed 6 months of account activity. The stack was thicker than I expected. I took it home in a sealed envelope and did not open it until Patricia came over that evening. She arrived with a grocery store rotisserie chicken, 2 containers of soup, and the expression of a woman who had already decided she would not leave until she knew I had eaten something. You do not have to feed me, I told her. I know, she said. That is why I'm doing it. Patricia and I sat at my kitchen table while the pages lay between us. At first, everything looked ordinary. My electric bill, my prescriptions, groceries, charitable donation, a check I had written to my church pantry. Then the unfamiliar transactions began. $2,000 sent to Michael's personal account. $4,500 labeled home support. Another payment to a company called Hawthorne Capital Solutions. Then a withdrawal of $7,000 marked account restructuring. I had never heard of Hawthorne Capital Solutions. I had never approved account restructuring. And I certainly had not needed Michael to send himself money for home support. Patricia read quietly beside me as I wrote every date, amount, and description in a notebook. By the time we finished, the total was more than $23,000. I stared at the number until it blurred. He took this from me, I whispered. Patricia put her hand over mine. Someone used your trust, she said. That is what happened. But he is my son. Yes, she said softly, and that is why it hurts this much. That night, Michael called. I watched his name pulse across my phone until the ringing almost stopped. Then I answered. Hello, Michael. His voice was sharp with panic. Did you go to the bank? Yes. Why would you do that without telling me? I looked at the notebook in front of me. Why did you change my account settings without telling me? He was silent. Then he tried a different approach. Mom? This is exactly what I was afraid of. You are listening to people who do not understand your situation. My situation? You are alone? Dad is gone. You are overwhelmed, whether you admit it or not. I am not overwhelmed. I am asking questions. You froze money that was being moved for your protection? What protection? It was an investment account. Whose investment account? His breathing caught. For the first time in my life, I heard my son searching for a lie. It was going to benefit you. Then why was the confirmation sent to an email address that is not mine? Nothing. Michael, I said. Did you request $85,000 from my savings? It is not as simple as you think. It is a yes or no question. His voice changed then. The fear disappeared, and irritation replaced it. You have no idea what I have been dealing with. You are right, I said, because you did not tell me the truth. He let out a slow breath. I cannot explain this over the phone. Then do not come to my house until you can explain it honestly. You are letting Susan Hale poison you against your own family. No, I said. I am finally allowing someone to speak to me as if I am still a person. I ended the call. My hands trembled after I hung up, but I did not call him back. The following afternoon, Susan called me into her office. Her voice was steady, but I could hear concern beneath it. Rebecca, I need to tell you about a filing that came through this morning. What kind of filing? Michael has petitioned the probate court for emergency guardianship. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. Guardianship? He is claiming that you are unable to manage your finances safely, and that you are being influenced by people who do not have your best interests at heart. I sat down slowly in the chair across from her desk. He wants the court to take away my right to make decisions. Yes, Susan said. He is asking for authority over your finances, your living arrangements, and potentially your medical choices. The room felt suddenly too small. I had expected Michael to argue with me. I had expected him to be angry that I went to the bank. I had not expected him to put his accusation in a legal document. Susan placed a copy of the petition in front of me. It claimed I had become forgetful after William's death. It claimed I had missed bills, become confused at medical appointments, and refused reasonable help from my family. It even stated that I had become emotionally unstable whenever the sale of my house was discussed. I read those words once. Then I read them again. It was not only a lie, it was a blueprint. Every small comment Michael had made, every time he answered a doctor's question for me, every changed paper statement, every time he called me defensive for objecting, he had been preparing this story for months. He filed this after the bank stopped the transfer. Susan said, that timing matters. He thinks if he controls me, he can control the trust. Perhaps, she said, but the trust documents are not the only thing that protects you now. Susan explained what would happen next. Because Michael had asked for emergency authority, the court would schedule a hearing quickly. A judge would decide whether there was any immediate reason to appoint someone to control my life before a full review could occur. We will respond with evidence, Susan said. Your medical records? The bank changes. The transfer request. William's diary. Your own testimony. I looked down at the petition. What if they believe him? Susan leaned forward. Rebecca, grief is not incompetence. Aging is not incompetence. And having a son who speaks over you does not make him qualified to speak for you. That was the first time I felt something other than fear. I felt anger. Not wild anger. Not the kind that makes a person reckless. A quiet anger that made me sit up straighter. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. The days leading up to it were difficult. But they were not empty. Susan gave me work to do. I gathered every bill I had paid on time. I printed the calendar where I recorded appointments, medication refills, church events, and lunches with Patricia. I found the contractor invoice for the porch repair I had arranged myself. I located the property tax files Michael had claimed I could no longer manage. Dr. Patel agreed to evaluate me and write a letter based on fact, not on my son's opinion. During the appointment, he asked me questions about the date, my medications, current events, my finances, and the reasons I had come to see him. I answered every one. When he finished, he rested his pen on the desk. Rebecca, I want to be clear, he said. You are grieving your husband. That is real. You have arthritis and high blood pressure. both of which are being managed. But I have not observed cognitive impairment that would prevent you from making your own decisions. I swallowed hard. Michael told you I was confused. He expressed concerns. Dr. Patel said carefully. But I also noticed that he frequently interrupted you. You appeared capable of answering for yourself. It meant more to me than I could explain. To hear a professional say it plainly. Not because I needed permission to know my own mind, but because Michael had tried to make me doubt it. Aaron from the bank also agreed to provide records. He documented the date my paper statements had been stopped, the temporary post office box address, the added contact authority, and the stalled $85,000 transfer. The account changes had been submitted through access credentials, connected to an old tablet Michael had helped me set up after William died. I had thought he was teaching me how to use it. Instead, he had kept a door open into my life. Lauren sent me a message 2 days before the hearing. We never wanted things to get ugly. Michael is only trying to protect you. Please, stop letting outsiders turn you against your own family. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I forwarded it to Susan and did not reply. I had spent too many years believing silence meant keeping peace. Now I understood that silence can also become permission. The answer to why Michael had done all of this arrived the evening before the hearing. Patricia was sitting with me in the living room when the doorbell rang. I did not open the door immediately. Through the glass, I saw a man in a charcoal coat holding a leather portfolio. He looked too formal to be a neighbor and too serious to be selling anything. Mrs. Clark? He asked, when I opened the door a few inches. Yes? My name is Daniel Webb. I work with the County Financial Crimes Unit. I apologize for arriving without an appointment. My stomach tightened. Is this about Michael? He gave a small nod. May I come in and ask you a few questions? Patricia remained close as I led him to the kitchen table. Mr. Webb opened his portfolio and placed several documents in front of me. He explained that Hawthorne Capital Solutions was being investigated after several investors reported missing funds and misleading project information. Michael's name appeared on records related to the company. So did the name of a man named Kevin Shaw. William had written Kevin's name in the blue diary. The first $10,000 loan had not been for a simple construction delay. It had been connected to something far more unstable. We are still determining exactly who knew what. Mr. Webb said. But your son appears to have moved money into accounts connected to the company. I looked at the account records spread across my table. Did he use my money? Based on what we have reviewed so far, some of the transfers from your accounts were followed by payments to entities associated with that business. The grief I felt then was different from grief for William. William had been taken from me by life. Michael had chosen to betray me. I thought he was worried about me. I said, Mr. Webb's expression softened. People who exploit family often use concern as cover. It makes the victim question themselves. He asked if I would provide my bank records, William's diary, and any messages from Michael or Lauren. I told him yes. My voice sounded stronger than I felt. After he left, Patricia poured coffee for both of us. Neither of us drank it. I failed him somehow. I whispered. Patricia shook her head. No. You loved him. Those are not the same thing. The next morning, Susan met me at the courthouse. The building was smaller than I had imagined. Beige vase. Fluorescent lights. A security line. People holding folders full of secrets they probably wished had stayed inside their families. Michael and Lauren were already sitting outside the courtroom. When Michael saw me, he stood. Mom, he said. I stopped a few feet away. He looked exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes were red around the edges. For one brief second, I saw the little boy he had been. Then I remembered the boxes. The hidden email address. The petition asking a judge to take my life away from me. You do not get to call me Mom when you are trying to make me disappear, I said quietly. Lauren looked down. Michael's face tightened. You do not understand what is happening. That is not true, I replied. I understand more than you ever intended. The courtroom door opened, and Susan placed one hand gently against my shoulder before we walked inside. Inside the courtroom, everything looked ordinary. There were no dramatic cameras, no angry crowds, no music telling anyone which side was right. There was only a judge behind a wooden bench, a clerk typing quietly, and two families sitting on opposite sides of a room because one of them had stopped treating the other like family. Michael sat with Lauren and an attorney he had hired only days earlier. I sat beside Susan. For most of my life, I had avoided places like that courtroom. I believed private problems should stay private. I believed family conflicts should be handled with patience, forgiveness, and conversation. But there are times when private pain becomes public because someone has used secrecy as a weapon. The judge began by explaining that the hearing was limited. He was not deciding every issue that day. He was deciding whether Michael had shown enough evidence to take emergency control over my finances, my home, and my personal decisions. Michael's attorney spoke first. He described me as a grieving widow who had become isolated after William's death. He said, I was resisting necessary support and becoming vulnerable to manipulation by outside advisors. When he said that, I looked at Susan. She did not react. She simply wrote something down. Then Michael took the stand. I had never seen my son look so rehearsed. He spoke about the house being too much for me. He said he worried about the stairs. He said I had forgotten bills and become confused during conversations. He claimed he had arranged the Willow Creek Senior Living Tour because he feared I would fall, get sick, or make a financial mistake without anyone noticing. I only wanted her to be safe, he said. His voice cracked at the right moment. For a second, I almost believed him. Then Susan stood. Mr. Clark, she said, when did you first become concerned that your mother could no longer manage her finances? Michael looked down. After my father died. Can you give us a specific example? She was overwhelmed by bills. Which bills did she fail to pay? He hesitated. I do not remember the exact ones. Susan handed him a document. These are Mrs. Clark's payment records for the 18 months following her husband's death. Can you point to any unpaid utility? Mortgage, property tax, insurance, or medical bill? Michael looked at the papers. No. Did your mother ever ask you to redirect her bank mail to a post office box? No. But she was having trouble keeping up with paperwork. That was not my question. Did she ask you to do it? No. Did she ask you to switch her statements to electronic delivery? No. Did she authorize you to add yourself as an account contact? Michael's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the question. Michael swallowed. I was helping her. That is also not my question. Susan said. Did she authorize it? His answer came quietly. No. The courtroom became so still I could hear the clerk typing. Susan continued. Did Mrs. Clark authorize an $85,000 transfer from her savings into an investment account? Michael's face changed. That account was intended to protect her assets. Was it in her name? It was connected to an investment opportunity. Was it in her name? No. Susan stepped closer. Whose name was it in? Michael did not answer. The judge looked directly at him. Mr. Clark, answer the question. He stared at the table. It was in the name of a business entity. What business entity? Susan asked. Hawthorne Capital Solutions. A quiet sound moved through the courtroom. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition that the truth had finally entered the room. Susan placed another document in front of the judge. It was the bank record showing the transfer request. Then she showed the account profile changes, the temporary mailing address, the unfamiliar email, the dates. Each one had been made before Michael filed for emergency guardianship. Each one had made it easier for him to take control without me knowing. Then Susan presented William's blue diary. She did not read every page. She did not have to. She read only the entries showing the earlier loans Michael had requested, his refusal to provide paperwork, and William's warning that I should contact Susan before Michael gained access to anything. Michael stared at the diary as if he had never seen it before. Maybe he had not. Maybe he had searched every obvious drawer, every folder, every box in my house, and still missed the one thing William knew to hide. Susan then called Dr. Patel. He explained that I had no diagnosis of dementia, no documented cognitive impairment, and no condition that made me incapable of managing my affairs. He said grief did not make me incompetent. He also stated that Michael had repeatedly answered questions directed at me, even when I appeared fully able to answer. Finally, I was asked to speak. My knees felt unsteady as I walked to the witness stand. I raised my right hand and promised to tell the truth. Then I looked at the judge. My husband and I built our life carefully. I said, "We worked for our home. We saved for our future. We raised our son believing that family meant you helped one another when help was needed." My voice shook once. "Iletit? I do not deny that I am older. I do not deny that I miss my husband. I do not deny that I may need help someday. But needing help someday is not the same as giving up every decision today." I looked toward Michael. I never asked him to change my bank information. I never asked him to hide my statements. I never asked him to move my money. And I never asked him to pack my memories into boxes and tell me where I should live. Michael's eyes filled, but I did not stop. For months, he kept telling me I was confused. He said I was too emotional. He told people I could not understand what was happening, but I understood enough to know that he was trying to take control before I could ask questions. Then I said the one thing I had needed to say most. I am not a problem to be managed. I am his mother, and I am still myself. The judge did not rule immediately. He reviewed the documents in silence, asked several questions, and then looked at Michael. Emergency guardianship is an extraordinary measure. He said, "It is not a tool for resolving family disagreements, financial stress, or adult children's concerns about future inheritance." Michael lowered his head. The judge continued, "The evidence before this court shows that Mrs. Clark has maintained her affairs, that she has appropriate legal protections in place, and that unauthorized changes were made to her financial profile by the petitioner. The request for emergency guardianship is denied." For a moment, I could not breathe. Then the judge added words I will never forget. "Mrs. Clark retains full authority over her residence, finance, healthcare, and personal decisions." Full authority. They were simple words, but after months of being spoken over, doubted, and quietly pushed aside, they felt like the return of something sacred. The judge also ordered that Michael have no access to my accounts or legal documents without my written permission. Susan was instructed to submit the bank records and related material to the appropriate investigators. Michael stood as the hearing ended. "Mom," he said. I did not turn around right away. When I did, his face looked smaller somehow. Not younger. Not innocent. Just stripped of the certainty he had carried into my house. "I did not want this to happen," he said. I looked at him carefully. "You made it happen the first time you decided my life was yours to control." Lauren stood beside him. Silent. I had expected her to argue. I had expected her to blame me. Susan. Or Patricia. Instead, she looked frightened. Maybe she had finally understood that Michael's lies had not been told only to me. They had been told to anyone who made it easier for him to keep taking. 2 weeks after the hearing, Daniel Webb contacted Susan. The county investigation had expanded. Hawthorne Capital Solutions was connected to several questionable investment deals, including projects that had been advertised as profitable renovations, but had never been completed. Kevin Shaw was under investigation, and Michael had been identified as someone who had recruited funds and transferred money connected to the business. The investigation did not happen overnight. No one was arrested in my living room. No dramatic handcuffs appeared on my porch. Instead, there were interviews, financial records, legal notices, and a process that moved slowly because truth often has to be organized before it can be proven. Michael eventually admitted that he had taken money from my accounts to cover losses and repayments tied to Hawthorne Capital Solutions. He insisted he had intended to replace it once a deal closed. But no deal had closed. And by then, he had been desperate enough to sell my house, move me into assisted living, and ask a court to take away my independence. He returned the money he could access. The rest became part of a repayment agreement negotiated through attorneys. The criminal investigation into the company continued separately. I did not celebrate. There was no joy in knowing my son had reached that point. But there was relief in knowing the truth no longer lived only inside me. I changed the locks on my house. That decision hurt more than I expected. Michael had once had a key because he was my son. I had never imagined needing to take it back. But Susan reminded me that boundaries are not punishments. They are protections. Patricia helped me choose a small security system. Dr. Patel continued to see me as my doctor, not as evidence. Aaron checked in once to make sure the bank had everything properly secured. And Susan helped me create a new estate plan. I did not remove Michael from my life entirely, but I removed the automatic access he had mistaken for a right. My home remained in the trust. My financial decisions remained mine. Any future help would be chosen by me. In writing, with people who respected my voice. Months passed before Michael asked to meet. He chose a small diner outside town, the kind with cracked red booths and coffee that never tasted quite fresh. I almost did not go, but I did. Not because I was ready to forgive him, because I wanted to hear whether he had finally learned to tell the truth. He looked different when he sat across from me. Thinner, tired, older. I was ashamed, he said. I waited. I lost money. I kept thinking I could fix it before anyone found out. Then Dad got sick. And I thought if I could get control of things, I could solve everything. You thought control was the same as solving it, I said. He looked down. Yes. And when I said no, I panicked. You did more than panic. Michael, you lied about me. You tried to make me look incapable. You tried to erase my choices. His eyes filled with tears. I know. For the first time, he did not add an excuse after those words. I believed he was sorry, but I had learned that sorrow and trust are not the same thing. I love you. I told him. That will always be true. But love does not restore what you broke. Your actions will have to do that. Slowly. Over time. He nodded. I understand. I hoped he did. But I no longer needed hope to be proof. The first spring after the hearing, I unpacked the last box from my living room. Inside was my mother's quilt. I spread it across the back of the sofa, then opened the windows and let the mild Ohio air move through the house. Outside, the maple tree William planted years ago had started to bloom again. Patricia came over that afternoon with coffee. We sat on the porch without saying much. For a long time, I thought strength meant enduring whatever people did to you without making trouble. I thought being a good mother meant protecting my child from every consequence. even when he had created the danger himself. I do not believe that anymore. Real love has room for truth. Real dignity has room for boundaries. And peace that requires you to disappear is not peace at all. If Rebecca's story reminded you that age never takes away your right to be heard, please subscribe to Rebecca's Justice Stories. Like this video and share it with someone who needs the reminder. And tell me in the comments, could you forgive a family member who betrayed your trust, even if you never gave them access again?